What's the best way to protect themselves against inflation risk?
I think without a doubt, risk that really matters. Inflation could be crazy high, but if your retirement lasts for 10 years, not that big of a deal.
The 4% rule, is this 4% rule still a useful guideline, or should we rethink the whole way?
Or kind of overly negative on it. Like, it was pretty groundbreaking at the time.
How much money is left when we retire? So we always talk about the fear of people running out of money when they retire.
You go to 10 financial planners, you'll get 18 different financial plans. And so there's this massive range of subjective outcomes that exist in planning today. You can't develop tools that can consume all the information. I do believe it's going to be possible to train models that can do almost all of it.
This is The Blonde Dollar with Ignacio Ramirez. Quick disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not constitute financial investment or legal advice. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional advice. Always do your own research and consult a qualified advisor before making any financial decisions. All investments involve risk, including the potential loss of capital. And now, let's get started with the episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of The Blonde Dollar. Today, we have the great honor of having with us David Blanchett, who's the head of retirement research at PGIM, a forming Morningstar heavyweight and one of the most well-known names in financial planning research across the globe, but more specifically in the US. David has spent his career tearing apart financial assumptions and backing up his insights with some of the most respected research in the industry. He spent decades studying retirement income, investment strategies, and the real spending habits of retirees. And he often debunked conventional wisdom along the way. He's been published literally everywhere. He won more awards that I can literally count. And he isn't afraid to call out bad industry takes when he sees them. Today in this conversation, we're obviously going to be talking a lot about retirement and retirement planning. We'll touch topics like why most retirement plans are based on flawed assumptions and what are some of the biggest mistakes investors make when planning for retirement. If you care about understanding money, markets, and the reality of financial planning beyond all the industry noise, you are going to absolutely love this episode. David, welcome to the show. It's amazing to have you on The Blonde Dollar. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Fantastic. So just for context, the CFA Institute introduced us because both David and I are going to be attending the CFA Live Summit 2025 in Chicago. And we're both going to be participating on a panel discussion called the robo-advisory evolution and how client relationships are going to evolve in the future with the arrival of technology, AI, and so on. And we're going to be talking, of course, a lot about that today. So I thought about dividing this conversation in three blocks. Maybe we can start off talking about retirement planning. Then we can talk about the psychology of spending and investing. And then on the third block, we'll get into the details of that panel and we'll talk about the future of financial advice. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
So maybe we can start by just hearing what is it that you're doing exactly right now at PGIM?
Sure. So at PGIM, I am a head of retirement research and a portfolio manager. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about, how do we design multi-asset portfolios for different types of investors. The two main solutions I work with are our target date series and then some retirement spending portfolios. We're also developing our own robo-like tool, an advice engine that can provide digital advice. And then I also do a lot just in terms of research around retirement. Retirement's pretty complicated. And I think, how we think about the key assumptions and any kind of analysis or financial plan is really, really important. And so it affects kind of all the stuff that I do. It affects the definition of the optimal portfolio. It affects advice on how much you have to save. It affects decisions around allocating to lifetime income. So doing a better job modeling retirement can help us make better decisions for investors.
So I like to think about myself as the finance nerd, but you're probably the quintessential retirement nerd. I'm going to ask you a lot of nerdy questions about that today.
That's the case, yeah.
So let's start talking about retirement planning assumptions, because most retirement models assume steady spending, predictable inflation, and linear withdrawals. But the reality is that, of course, retirees don't spend the same amount every year. Sometimes healthcare costs spike, and of course, spending patterns are shifting. So what is the biggest flaw in traditional retirement planning models, and how should we actually be thinking about retirement spending?
Sure. So taking a step back, a point that I've been researching retirement, I don't know, for at least 15, maybe 20 years. And a point that I make is that retirement is the most expensive purchase you're ever going to make, right? If you do, a net present value of the series of cash flows, that liability, for most Americans, it's millions of dollars. It's a really big number. And so when thinking about how much you have to save, it's really important to kind of have a good model to think about what that goal looks like, because, no one likes to, well, not no one. Few people like to save money. I don't like saving money. I'd much rather go out and buy something or go on vacation or do something else. And so I think that asking ourselves, like, what are the key assumptions that we use when it comes to any kind of forecast? And then thinking about how accurate they are is really, really important. And for better or worse, a lot of the assumptions, or I'd say most of the assumptions that advisors use in financial plans for clients haven't really changed in 30 years. And so, one of the things that I'm kind of really focused on is hoping that as an industry, we can evolve. And so, what are some of the key challenges right now with assumptions? Well, there's quite a few. Like one is we have moved as an industry away from kind of purely deterministic forecasts. So when I got in this industry 20 years ago, when you did a financial plan, you would assume that the portfolio goes up 6% a year for 30 or 40 years. That's one heck of a portfolio, right? I don't know that I can design a portfolio that goes up 6% a year without fail. Maybe you can. Sure. That's not an accurate assumption. And so we've evolved into a place where we do, Monte Carlo or stochastic models, where there's randomness as part of the analysis. And that's an improvement because we're acknowledging uncertainty. The question, though, is how do we do that effectively? And, to your point, most financial planning tools assume that someone takes out like the same amount every year plus inflation. They never make a change. If the markets go up, the markets go down. We use success rates as the outcomes metric. So it's a binary objective function. Either I accomplish all of my goal in its entirety or I'm deemed to fail. And my concern is that when you kind of relax these assumptions and you use better models around, how people spend, how they experience an outcome, you can kind of radically affect how much they have to save, how much they can spend. Do I allocate the lifetime income? So, like these things might sound trivial, but when you kind of just improve the key assumptions in these forecasts, it can lead to just wildly different advice and guidance.
So I have a few questions about those models, but before that, you said 15, 20 years in retirement planning. How did you land in this area? I mean, did you wake up one day and you're like, oh my God, this is it. I want to become a retirement planner? Because it's not the sexiest of topics, right? When you think about it.
Yeah, my wife's a veterinarian, and like our kids love to have her visit, like the school fairs and like what do my parents do? I've never been like freely. No one asks, "Hey, David's a retirement guy. Come talk to us about what you do." So
I have the same thing as a fixed income advisor. I'm in your team here.
Yeah. So it's funny when I actually had been drawn to the field of financial planning when I was in high school. I don't know why. I think just investing in general, I really enjoyed investing. And I think based upon kind of where I lived and who I interacted with, my only kind of window into what I could do was being a financial planner. So I was doing internships in high school, in college. And, at a very young age, though, I started kind of looking into, well, how do I help people make better choices? There's a designation, the CFP exam, a Certified Financial Planner. I actually passed that when I was 21. I finished the CFA when I was 24. I've had a whole, and so I think part of the problem is I'm a son of two teachers. My mom and dad taught math and science, but at an early age, I was fascinated by the idea of financial planning. And I also just realized that some of the times when you go to work for a company and they tell you to sell something or do something, that isn't always the best thing that you could be doing for that household. And so I wanted to learn myself what should I be recommending these people do? And so it kind of took me on this path of doing research in the field of financial planning. And the one topic that I always come back to is retirement, because retirement is just so complex and there's so many different ways to think about it that, I kind of evolved from being a financial advisor as part of a team into now it's really kind of, my focus is a lot more like research and investment based.
Okay. Wow. That's a cool answer. And yeah, I mean, having two parents that are teachers, I guess you learned your maths quite early, which explains why you're so good with models. And you were alluding about models and the assumptions before. When I think personally about models, one of the hardest variables, I guess, that one could factor in is not only the rates of return, but is also things like inflation. Particularly when it comes to retirement planning, right? Because inflation erodes your purchasing power over time, is enemy number one of retirement savings, I guess, the same way as it is enemy number one for bonds, which is the asset class that I cover. And as a retired person, you don't have salary increases to offset that impact. So, of course, some advisors recommend tips, others say dividend stocks, and some others argue that real assets is the way to go. But my question for you is, what's the best way for retirees to protect themselves against inflation risk?
So in the US, right, our public pension system, Social Security, it offers income for life that's linked to inflation explicitly. There are no other lifetime income products that are sold in the US that offer an uncapped benefit linked to inflation. So in terms of, like where to go in terms of getting inflation protection, I think without a doubt, delayed claim to Social Security is kind of that risk-free asset, because not only does it cover inflation explicitly, but it also covers the longevity component, which is really complicated, right? I make the point that the risk that really matters for retirement is longevity risk, right? Inflation could be crazy high, but if your retirement lasts for 10 years, not that big of a deal. Right, where all the risks kind of grow exponentially is the possibility of living to 30 or 40 years in retirement. So to me, the place you start when it comes to inflation protection is delayed claim of Social Security. Beyond that, there's a lot of things you can do. You mentioned tips. There's real assets. I think that this is where a lot of the behavioral stuff comes in, because I mean, you and I can both do a great job building someone efficient portfolio, but my experience working with households is that, what an optimizer might deem to be suboptimal is something that they're willing to follow at a much better, rate of likelihood than a truly efficient portfolio. So, I mean, I think that diversification is key. I don't have kind of like a single place I look, because I think it depends upon what that investor or household is looking to accomplish.
So you were talking about the longevity and the risk of living longer than expected, which I guess is a good thing to have as a problem. But that makes me think about the 4% rule, which I think it was created in the 90s when bond yields were a lot higher, between 6 to 8% in the US. And people, of course, also didn't live as long as today. Now everything has changed. Is this 4% rule still a useful guideline, or should we rethink the whole way we're thinking about retirement?
Yeah, so that was work by Bill Bengen. It's kind of like the OG research when it comes to retirement income, right? And people, I think people are kind of overly negative on it. Like, it was pretty groundbreaking at the time. Right. So, for those listeners that don't know what the 4% rule is, what Bill did, and this has been replicated hundreds, if not thousands of times now, is he used historical data and said, if we're going to assume retirement lasts for 30 years and I'm in a balanced portfolio, what can I take out in the first year of retirement where that amount is then increased by inflation every year for 30 years? So what's really important is that percentage isn't an ongoing withdrawal rate. It's an initial withdrawal rate increased by inflation. And what he found is he was using U.S. historical returns, is that 4%-ish was the safe initial withdrawal rate. So over the last, 70, 80 years of the time, that was the most that you could take out to be safe. Now, there's been, 30 years of research kind of building upon that. Personally, I think that 5% is probably a better place to start when you think about the structure of a household liability, structure of the assets, things like that. But I think it's still a useful starting place. Now, what I really wish he had said, though, versus doing 4%, is said it's a 25 times rule. 1 divided by 4% is 25 for the math folks out there. Because that's really all it's telling you is how much do you have to have saved when you first retire, assuming you're about 65 years old. It doesn't really apply as an ongoing withdrawal percentage. It's not necessarily highly relevant for someone who is 75 or 80 years old. But I think what it is it was a much, whether it's 4% or 25x, it's a much different number than a lot of folks were used to. They would think, I can take out 8% and be fine. No, that's way too high. So I think that collectively, a lot of us have kind of thought about, what are the key assumptions in his model and how do we improve those? But I really do think that it was great research, and it's still reasonable today.
Definitely one of the numbers that comes to mind when you think about retirement planning. So it really shows indeed how he was the OG of research, as you were saying. So one cannot all talk about models without thinking either about Monte Carlo, given that it's super present in all parts of the financial industry. Are Monte Carlo simulations also useful for retirement planning, or you think not at all?
So I think they can be, right? So I have a very healthy dose of reality, right? This notion that we can somehow build a model that is going to accurately predict like what happens next in the markets and in someone's life over the next 50 years it's kind of nonsense, right? Like it's going to be wrong. But I think the key is to make it as reasonable as possible. So again, I think that moving away from these kind of purely deterministic forecasts where markets go up 6% a year to a model where we can vary things is useful, right? I think that the question though is, again, it's what are we using as our key assumptions in this model in terms of their usefulness? And so one example is that, a lot of advisors use pure historical returns. And that's problematic because, the returns in of different countries have varied wildly. And so if, someone's using pure historical returns in Germany versus the US versus Portugal versus, say, Spain, you could get dramatically different estimates of what a safe withdrawal rate is. Because and the issue there is that people use this in expectation. I would argue that at the end of the day, retirees don't really care what you could have done historically. They want to know what they're going to experience. And that's where I think, so one important evolution in how we think about Monte Carlo is using expected returns. And this is kind of intuitive for anyone that builds portfolios. You're not just going to use pure historical returns, but it's very common for advisors to use pure historical returns. And so I think there has been movement there, but there are still issues around, assuming, again, this idea of static withdrawals, that someone takes out a certain amount and then increases it by inflation. And then also just success rates. Most models assume that either you accomplish your goal or you fail. And what that doesn't capture is this notion of a more continuous range of possibilities, right? I would contend that if your goal is to have $100,000 a year for 30 years, and in the 30th year of retirement, you fall $10,000 short, you didn't fail, right? You just barely didn't accomplish your goal. And using a binary objective function, I think, can often lead to advice and guidance that just isn't very good. I think that we need to collectively kind of improve our models and improve the way that we estimate outcomes to ensure, again, that the advice is reasonable given all the estimation that are present.
And have you seen any developments in that field as of late? Like what's in your opinion, the best models at the moment to try
Sure.
to?
So, I think there are other companies developing tools. Like we're developing one. I know others, are really kind of asking this question of, what is a good retirement income forecasting tool, right? Like one of the things I say is, so success rates, like that's the outcomes metric that you often receive in these reports. So what it is what percentage of the runs or trials in this projection did you accomplish your goal in its entirety? And one thing I say is that you should never tell a client a success rate, right? You should never tell them that you have an 87% chance of accomplishing your goal, because all they're going to think is, I have a 13% chance of eating cat food or some kind of diet. That's not what that means at all. And so I think one thing that we could do today is you just map success rates to ranges And that's all you tell a client. If your success rate exceeds 80%, you're in fantastic shape. Let's come back again next year. So I think there are things we could do right now to help clients internalize what these projections are. But for some reason, a lot of advisors like to tell them the number. Like they like this sense of false precision. Oh, I can tell you you've got an 87.34% success rate. I'm like, who cares? Like that's not a reasonable thing for someone to interpret. And so one, let's change the way that we communicate these results to clients so that they can better understand what it actually means for their situation.
One of the other big ideas that comes to mind when I hear you talk is obviously future returns. And I read this interesting concept, the sequence of returns, because it's not how much you earn in retirement, but when you actually earn it. Because if the market tanks in your first 5 years of retirement, your portfolio may never recover, right? Even if the market does. So how should investors actually manage sequence of return risk in their portfolios beyond just diversify and hope for the best? Hey there, quick favor to ask. If you enjoy the blunt dollar, the unfiltered takes, the stories, and the laughs, the easiest way to support the show is by tapping that subscribe button right now while you're listening. And here's my promise. If you do, I'll keep bringing you honest conversations, fresh perspectives, and the kind of finance talk that's engaging, insightful, and worth your time. Thanks so much for being here, and let's keep these great finance conversations going.
Sure. So, one of the most cited risks in retirement is sequence risk. And all that really suggests is that the returns that you experience earlier in retirement have a disproportionate impact on whether or not you accomplish your goal. So, for example, if the market goes down 20% in the first year of retirement, that's going to have a much larger impact on your particular outcome than if it goes down 20% in the 30th year of retirement. And so there's been, a lot of research on, well, how do you mitigate or minimize sequence risk? Well, one thing that you could do is you could put all your portfolio in safe assets, so fixed income. And the problem there is that it's kind of like a scale where, yes, sequence risk is an issue, but so too is longevity risk, right? If you put all your money in cash, you would effectively eliminate sequence risk. You could argue there's still kind of like some inflation risk there, things like that. But the problem with that is then if you keep it invested conservatively, that portfolio is not going to last more than 25 or 30 years. And it's certain. And so I think that to me, the key is just being diversified. It is just having a very diversified portfolio and investing for the long term, right? I think that every retiree out there, if to the extent possible, should have lifetime income that covers their essential expenses. And what that does is it gives them a lot more flexibility around if the markets do go down, you can cut back and adapt, right? If we go back, 10 minutes, we're talking about how a lot of the models work. When you assume static withdrawals, you assume a complete inability to adjust spending if the markets misbehave. I think what you see though is if you have income that's protected for life, that covers your essential expenses, and the markets go down, it'll affect you less in the long term because you can adapt, right? Where sequence risk is just really, really dangerous is that if you don't have that ability to adapt, you have to keep taking those withdrawals, and that kind of creates almost a death spiral for your portfolio. So again, having flexibility is just really important for retirement. And I think one way you get there is, again, just having lifetime income that covers your most essential expenses.
Yeah, it's funny when I hear you speak, because in my mind, I always thought about retirement planning as something very, very static. Once you're there and you don't touch it. But hearing you talk, I realize it's something a lot more dynamic and you have to have a much more flexible approach than what I thought. And that's really, really interesting. Thanks for that color. 180 degrees change here in terms of topics, still within retirement planning, but I'd like to talk about gender gap and why women face a tougher road, because obviously women tend to live longer than men, and we know, because there's been a lot of research out there, that they earn less over their lifetimes due to wage gaps until now. Thankfully, that's obviously starting to change, but that's the sad reality as of now. And a lot of retirement planning models obviously don't fully account for those unique challenges that women face. So how should retirement planning change to better address the financial realities that women face when it comes to retirement planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that women face, on average, a lot more challenges than men do. I think that just out of the gate, there's a longevity piece, right? In a marriage, the average spouse is 2-ish years younger. Women live 4 to 6 years longer on average. That creates 5 years on average that they'll be kind of on their own in retirement. And there's a lot of interesting implications there. Usually it's the male in the relationship that does the financial planning or the investment stuff, and to the extent that the spouse is not brought in, that can create a lot of complications and concerns when that first spouse passes away. There can be healthcare issues with the first spouse the spouse has to deal with. So there really is a lot there, and there isn't, at least in the U.S., in my opinion, a really good way to deal with long-term care risk. I think globally, there are effective solutions to deal with longevity risk via, either, public pensions or lifetime income annuities. But, I don't really have a great answer here. I think that, having a trusted advisor that the spouse can rely on, that both spouses can rely on to help in the event of a financial emergency is really important, because what you do see is issues like cognitive decline at older ages that make it, older Americans more likely to suffer from any kind of financial fraud or abuse. So I think that, again, like, this is, an area where having trusted advisors can just be so.
Yeah, definitely still lots of room of improvement there, and hopefully we're going to get there. And talking about another group of people for whom retirement is not necessarily easy, entrepreneurs and gig workers. The traditional retirement system in the US, but globally too, assumes steady paychecks, employer contributions, and things like that. But obviously, freelancers, entrepreneurs, and so on, a lot of times, or most of the times, there's no employer match and not a really structured savings plan. So how should people outside the traditional workforce plan for retirement when the system you've been talking about is not necessarily designed for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing we've learned in the US is to get people to save for retirement, it needs to be effectively automatic, right? So today, roughly 70%-ish of workers are covered by some kind of employer-sponsored retirement plan. This has gone up. I think that, in the US, given the incentives being created at the state level, at the federal level, well, we're going to see more gig workers, more employees have access to retirement savings plans. And I think that will improve participation and savings rates among those workers. To your point, though, I think there'll still be lots of people that are gig workers, that are self-employed, et cetera, that don't have access to these plans. And it is really tough. I think that to the extent that you can make it automatic, that's what's going to be so important. If you only save for retirement what is left at the end of the month, quarter, or year, you're going to find that to be a relatively small number. You have to kind of create a system like we do for workers, where the money comes out of your paycheck before you almost ever see it, right? And then you have to learn to live off the less. So I do believe we need, 401k like solutions where you get paid and then immediately you have 5 or 10% taken out and transferred to a different account that exists for retirement. Now, I do think there are some platforms that can do that, but I think that's what it will honestly take to get those types of workers better prepared for retirement, because we don't have the employer contribution. When it's not easy to save for retirement, it just doesn't end up being a priority.
It's interesting how humans adjust to whatever is left, and that idea of withdrawing a certain amount directly, I think is brilliant. And I think that's also a nice transition in the conversation to move towards the second part of this podcast, which is the psychology of spending and investing. So I'd like to start with a question about how much money is left when we retire. So we always talk about people, or the fear of people running out of money when they retire, but the actual data shows that retirees actually underspend, and they fear uncertainty so much that they actually die with more money than they actually needed. So my question is, why do so many retirees underspend, and how can advisors help them feel confident enough to actually enjoy more their hard-won money?
So this is a pretty big anomaly or puzzle, right? If you listen to some people, they'll talk about like this idea of a retirement crisis and how everyone is like, not prepared and no one has any money saved. But to your point, people don't spend at near the rate that most retirement economists would deem optimal, right? So I just released some research with Michael Finke, who's at the American College, and we did a kind of complex analysis looking at how households deploy all of their wealth. So how do they spend lifetime income, wage income, capital income from qualified and non-qualified accounts? You do a bunch of regressions and all this stuff to think, okay, well, how do different households who are retired use their wealth to fund consumption? What we find is that the only asset, and this is the term asset very broadly, that households tend to use effectively is lifetime income. So, we estimate they spend about 80-ish% or more of their lifetime income on average, okay? Everything else is closer to like 50%. So, for example, we talk about the 4% rule. We find that the average withdrawal, that's the coefficient from a regression, whatever, from qualified savings for 65-year-olds is 2%. Okay, so 2% is half of 4%, and I think that 5% is a better starting place. And
wow.
it didn't matter what it was. They're not spending from other assets like they are from lifetime income. And someone might say, well, that's not rational. Well, I would say, well, I mean, it kind of is, right? When you don't know how long you're going to live, and you don't know what the market's going to do, you don't know what inflation's going to do, it creates this incentive to spend less. I think what happens is people have this giant pot of savings. They don't want to touch the savings, and so they kind of learn to live off of less in retirement. So they consistently and then kind of persistently underspend because they don't want to be a Walmart greeter. Like they don't want to have to go back to work, and they kind of fear gloom and doom. And so the only kind of good idea that I have here is that in theory, yes, an advisor can help someone spend more in retirement. Okay, in reality, most of the folks that are in the study have financial advisors, so they're already in theory doing that. I think that can help, but I think that even an advisor can't provide guarantees around future market returns, around future longevity. So having that base of lifetime income is really important, because I think people understand this notion that no matter how long I live, I'm going to receive income, and effectively nothing else is guaranteed. So I think advisors can play a role here, but in the absence of the fact that they can't provide lifetime income guarantees, there's only so much they can do to kind of encourage spend.
Spend more, folks. Spend more. That's the idea. No, but
I mean, some folks do spend too much. So it's really hard to kind of generalize, because there are people that are vastly overspending. And so there's this fun notion of ants and grasshoppers. Okay, so if you think about what it takes to get to retirement, you have to be an ant. You have to be a diligent saver for your entire 30 or 40 lifetime working. Like, you got to be a great saver. Okay, you got to put money away. You got to see that portfolio grow. And the 401k statements in the U.S., the balance is the first thing you see. You don't want that balance to go down. Okay, then though, you train people to be ants for, let's just say, 30 years. Okay, then you get to retirement, and hey, go be a grasshopper. You trained yourself psychologically to save money, and defer gratification for 30 years, but now you have to spin that down. That's not an easy switch that most folks can make. And so the grasshoppers will keep being grasshoppers, and the ants keep being ants. It's hard to kind of turn one into the other, especially after doing something for so long.
I love that analogy. And yeah, the thing is that definitely talking about psychology, of course, at the end of a lifetime, with hindsight, you can say, oh yeah, he should have spent less or more. But I also understand that whilst you're in retirement, and you don't know how much you're going to live, how long, yeah, I'm with you. I can see why people tend to underspend. And one of the reasons also for that, I guess, is because of the fear of big sell-offs. And obviously, one of the yeah, the main problems is that the best financial plans don't work if people panic, because investors tend to overreact and they ignore all the things, I guess, that you explained to them, and can actually make emotional decisions than ruin their returns. So at the end of the day, and from your years working in the sector, how much of financial planning is actually about the models and the math that you were alluding to, and how much is it really just about managing human emotions?
So it's both, So I just had a piece in the Journal of Portfolio Management, it was effectively how to build portfolios factoring in FOMO or regret, fear of missing out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that early in my career, I would have been a lot more dismissive of the more behavioral aspects of investing, right? But what it takes to accomplish a goal is to remain invested in a portfolio for a long period of time. And so everyone has different perspectives, for example, on owning cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin, right? So I would say that I'm in the camp that I'm not necessarily a fan, but I think that there is a case that you could make to having someone allocate part of their portfolio to it, even if you hate the investment merits. If you're concerned that by not owning it, they may at some point say, you know what, I'm missing the boat here. I'm going to go all in into something else. And this is the same with employer stock, right? I've done a lot of research looking at this idea that no portfolio is an island, right? When you own a portfolio, it's a part of this kind of other stuff. And, things like human capital should affect how you invest your portfolio, right? And so technically, diversification says that you probably should never own employer stock. As soon as you get it, you should sell it. If you have RSUs, you should, but what if I worked at NVIDIA and I followed that great financial advice and all my colleagues are multimillionaires and I'm invested in this S&P 500 index? And so I think that what we have to acknowledge is how individuals would respond in different circumstances to different market events. And then this creates this kind of massively blows out this notion of an efficient portfolio, right? When you introduce, all the other things that people have in their preferences, I think what would seemingly be a very inefficient portfolio could be very efficient for an investor to the extent it helps them accomplish their goals. So I think that understanding the math and portfolio theory is very important. But for the individuals that deal with investors directly, especially households, I think that factoring in the behavioral things is just critical to ensure that they do have the highest chance of achieving whatever financial goals they're paying the advisor to help them accomplish.
So you're part-time analyst, part-time psychologist.
Well, I would say yes. I mean, I don't work at all these days with retail investors. I would say most of our clients are more institutional. But I do talk to advisors, and so I think that I do talk to normal humans too about retirement all the time as well. But I think that how but that takes the problem with that kind of personalization is that it's not necessarily easily scalable, right? But I think that's where advisors can truly add value. To call a spade, it's not difficult to go out today and get a relatively efficient, inexpensive portfolio using a variety of multi-asset products, right? There's tons of online information, there's tons of tutorials, there's robo tools, all these things. I think where there's going to be a niche for advisors into the future is, more than just investment planning, but also thinking about someone's situation and then, in adjusting that portfolio to kind of really build it based upon what that person is trying to accomplish, their preferences, all of that.
So you said before that your retirement savings is by far the most important investment you're going to make in your lifetime because of the present value of all those discounted future cash flows. But arguably the second most important investment for a lot of people out there is real estate and their homes. And we've noticed that many retired people stay in their homes long past the point where it makes financial sense for them. And even if downsizing could free up cash, reduce costs, and improve their quality of life overall, a lot of people still are hesitant to make the move. So what's driving this emotional attachment to real estate? And do you think should more people be open to selling their homes once they retire? Hey there, quick ad break. Do you work in the finance industry and have a genuinely interesting story to share? I'm always on the hunt for great guests who bring raw, unfiltered insights to the table. Or maybe you know someone with a story worth telling? Please put us in touch. You can reach out to me directly via LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. And now, back to the show.
I do. So I wrote some research called the home is a risky asset, right? And I think that, I think this is somewhat intuitive post 2008, but pre 2008, people had this idea that homes are great investments. Well, homes are not. Well, okay. So, maybe take a step back. Homes are kind of fascinating in that it's one of the few things that people purchase that are both investment and consumption goods, right? It's a consumption good in that I have to live somewhere that I typically have to pay for something. I guess I can move with my parents and maybe that's free. But for the most adults are going to have to live somewhere, right? But it's an investment good in that it has the potential to appreciate in value, right? Very, very few things that people buy, meet those two criteria. Like if you buy a car is a consumption good, but they depreciate like 1% a month in value. Not no appreciation there. And I think that because of that, and in the U.S. especially, we have lots of incentives to buy homes. You can deduct your mortgage interest, real estate taxes, all these things. So I think that owning a home though is also a very emotional purchase. I think about like the research that I did, and I think it was like one of the things people get wrong is how long they think they're going to live in a home, right? So I think it's kind of intuitive that the longer you live in a home, the higher the likelihood of that being a better economic decision versus renting. And especially younger Americans vastly overestimate by like a multiple of 2, like how long they'll live in a given home. Like you ask them how long you live in the home, they say, oh, we'll be here like 10 years. They're there for like 5 years. And so the problem is that really changes the math of renting versus buying. But, homes are also a means of forced savings. Like there's been a lot of great research showing like, yes, like even if certain assets, aren't as efficient as buying, the market, if it's a way to force individuals to save, it can be efficient from that perspective. So where they would have consumed the money on a vacation, they're willing to kind of use it for a house. And so I think that I've seen it myself. I could have contended to my wife back a few years ago that renting would be a better economic decision. The odds of that happening are zero. Like we're going to be homeowners. We're going to live in a neighborhood because of our schools and all that. So I do wish that more people would view homes as an asset that they can use to, deploy in retirement. There's reverse mortgages. There's lots of ways to do that, but I don't know that that's going to happen. What you often see though is homes are characterized as the asset of last resort for healthcare expenses. Most retirees want to leave their home to their kids. They're willing to use it as the asset to pay for healthcare should something happen. So I think it's definitely worth a conversation among lots of people, but I don't expect perspectives on that to change anytime soon.
Yeah, and homes have such a huge emotional value too that despite probably in a lot of cases making economic sense, there's that part where feelings take over, and I can see why so many people cling to their homes. Was research? Tell me.
I was going to say, people get wrong is the idiosyncratic risk of owning a home. Right? People talk about like the Case-Shiller home price index. And I'm like, whoa. Like the Case-Shiller home price index is a repeat sales index of like all the homes in America or whatever the region, you own one home in one place. And so that's like owning like a one micro cap stock or some tiny little thing that subjects you to just massive levels of idiosyncratic risk, right? Like people that bought homes in Detroit, like weren't, versus like San Diego. My brother lives in San Diego. Like Detroiters were very, very unlucky, right? The Californians have been incredibly lucky. You've got other places like Phoenix and Florida. And so I think that the issue with homes from like an investment perspective is that people often perceive them as being safe, and they are relatively safe, but there's just a massive amount of idiosyncratic risk that's not captured in a lot of the indexes people use when it comes to modeling residential real estate, for example.
So one of the things I learned about whilst researching for this podcast was the 1 more year syndrome, which is that many high-income professionals plan to retire early but keep delaying it because they worry about running out of money or losing purpose or missing out on the peak earning years of their career. in your view, why do people struggle to actually pull the trigger on retirement, and what's the best way to overcome that hesitation?
Well, so what's interesting is in the U.S., the effect is pretty pronounced, and I've done a lot on this. Ebree's been doing a long-range survey. Most Americans retire 3 years before they expect to do so. So then there's a Gallup poll that's really neat that shows kind of how both expected and actual retirement ages have increased pretty proportionally over time, where that gap is 3 years. And why that's really, really important is the number one thing that you can do to improve your retirement success rate, if we can just use that term, is delaying retirement, right? To your point, when you delay retirement in the US, you have one more year to save, one more year for your assets to grow, one more year to delay claiming Social Security, and one less year of income to fund. That can massively change your overall retirement economic situation. But people tend to retire before they expect to do so on average. And what's really important here is that people, when they tend to retire early, it's usually not because they choose to do so, right? Usually it's because they have a health issue with themselves or their spouse, they get laid off, or something else happens, right? Those who choose to retire early typically do so because they are in great shape financially. That's not the norm. And so what we do see is this to me is this is a risk that I don't think is properly incorporated in retirement financial plans. People say, oh, I'm not on track to retire at 65. I'll just work to 67, 68. Well, in reality, you're probably retire at 62. Okay. And that gap then of retiring 3 years before you expect to do so, I think is just financially devastating. Now, to your point, though, there is the opposite, right? I kind of get it. If I'm in the workforce, if I have a job and I have the ability to keep working an extra few years, I'm actually okay with that just one more year thing.
Especially if you like your job, right?
But so even if you don't, okay, like I call this, let's make a deal. Let's say that you hate your job, okay, but you're in a job that is pretty effectively utilizing your human capital, so you're well paid, okay? If you're in your 60s and you are to leave that job, whatever else you could get will likely not pay as well. You could take a 50%, 70%, whatever it is, haircut. Okay, so what I have said before to people is, let's say that you are older and you're not in the best shape for retirement, you want to retire. What I say is, okay, let's make a deal. Every penny that you are using to save for retirement, spend that on the thing that will keep you going. Go on vacations. I don't know, buy a boat, whatever it is, but just keep working. Because if you keep working, maybe you're not saving more for retirement, okay? But you're getting healthcare, if you're under 65, or your assets are growing, you're delaying claiming Social Security, you're not funding retirement, and you're giving yourself that social network. And so I get it. At some point, work becomes untenable for most people. But, like to the extent that you can keep going, I think people, who haven't, test run retirement think that, things are going to be great, I'm going to stop working and do this stuff. Well, people are often in for a huge shock. So the extent that you can tolerate your job, find a way to kind of negotiate with yourself about, reallocating that retirement savings, things you enjoy, to keep you in the game as long as you possibly can. Because realistically, like once you get out, at least in today's world, the odds of getting back in are just not very good.
And so talking about the way that the model is constructed, and maybe moving towards the third block of the conversation, the future, there's this model of work until 65, then retire, that some people think looks a little bit outdated. Do you think the idea of this traditional retirement will still exist in the future, or are we going to see it evolving to something completely different?
So I think that what we're going to see is what retirement is going to increasingly vary. I honestly don't. My title is head of retirement research, so I'm like, retirement is in my title. But I don't love the word retirement. I think that realistically, what people want is financial independence, right? Because retirement is a word that has baggage with it, sometimes negative baggage. And I think what most people are saving for is an opportunity to choose how they spend their time completely. Right. I like my job. Maybe I love my job. I don't know. But like, not everyone feels the same. Like, a lot of us are stuck doing things that, we'd rather, I don't know, go surfing or do art or something else. And so I think that why we save is to give ourselves, optionality around how our future selves spend their time. And so from that perspective, I think retirement has been viewed historically as a very kind of like you retire at 65, you play a little bit of golf, and then you die. I think that what we're going to see more of are mini retirements where individuals take time off, throughout their careers to kind of just pause and take a break. And I do think we're going to see, lots of different ways when individuals do get to older age where they kind of move away from that primary job they were using to kind of pay the bills to, other things that might pay a little bit, but that they enjoy more. To me, the key here is you have to save to create that optionality, right? If you want mini retirements, if you want to retire, if you want to, you have to be saving. So the point that I make is even if you don't want to quote unquote retire, you should still be saving to give your future self a choice about how you're going to spend your time, right? And if you don't save, you're not giving yourself very many choices. You're going to have to keep working for a long time. So the more you save, the more you give your future self options in terms of what you end up doing.
100% love the concept of having optionality. I think it's so important. A lot of people don't think about it, but it's definitely a privilege to get to that point where you can actually choose, and if you need to work more, then you can. But if you want to retire, then so be it. So that's really cool. So now talking about the future, I wanna get back to the topic we're gonna be discussing in Chicago. So again, for those of you that missed it, David and I are gonna be from the 4th to the 7th of May in Chicago at the CFA Left Summit. Amazing event, open to all finance professionals. I think there's gonna be over 1,000 attendees this time. There's gonna be amazing conversations around different topics related to the finance world. And one of the topics I'm most interested about is the future of the profession. So David and I are going to be in this panel talking about the robo-advisory evolution. And I want to talk to you about that, about robo-advisors and AI in general, because we've seen it in this past year. AI has gotten really, really good. And we're seeing tools handling portfolio management, tax optimization. We're even seeing now companies trying to do behavioral coaching. And my question, I guess, is whether investors are really trusting this tool. And the broader question, I guess, is will robo-advisors ever fully replace financial planners? Or is there something completely irreplaceable about humans?
Sure. So I've been building robo-advisors for 15 years, right? So it's been characterized as the revolution that wasn't, right? Because we haven't really seen the uptake in the use of digital-only tools for a while, right? There was just another one announced yesterday that is effectively going under. And, my perspective is that it's not possible to replace that human-to-human connection, right? You don't need AI to do robo, but I think you can use AI to provide methods of engagement that you can't create in more traditional robo-type tools. And, where I just see tremendous promise for the robo tools is that not every American can afford or even has access, this is probably global, to a high-quality financial advisor, right? If I only have $100,000 saved for retirement, the range of advisors that I could get is not going to be the same as if I had $1 million. And so what I hope is that it's kind of the democratization of advice, where everyone can get advice, high quality advice at a relatively low price point. Right? I think what robo does is it frees up individuals who might not want to pay 1% of their assets to someone to build a portfolio, and now they can get it for 25 basis points, right? To be clear, I do not think that human advisors are going away. We need humans for everything. Humans like talking to humans, but the key is there's a cost there, right? You can do more of the hybrid solutions, where you have a Zoom advisor and you can see price points there at less than 50 basis points. And so what I want is I want every American to have access to a tool, a solution, whatever you want to call it, that can help them make good financial choices. And I think that's where, but
please go ahead.
no, I think that's where robo excites me. I think that it's been a slog in terms of, adoption so far. But I mean, we're talking about AI. I think that, AI concerns me a little bit because of, like the hallucination. I think it can do a lot to improve things. You don't need AI for robo technically. Like there's already tons of robo tools out there that do things already. I think where the opportunity is just in a perfect world, every American has access to a low cost advice tool that can give them help based upon their personal situation. We'll never get there if it requires human advisor intervention. We can get there utilizing utilizing AI at some point in the future.
So in which areas do you think that these robo-advisors could outperform humans in? Leaving like the all the things about the empathy and the fact that humans like talking to humans, what do you think these robo-advisors could be better at than human advisors?
I don't think that robo technically, like anything a robo does, I as a human advisor can deploy. And so like I don't know that I would characterize the robo as being better than a human, because in theory, I as the human advisor could utilize multiple robo advisors, and that can be the technology that powers my advice. And so I think that advisors will increasingly, human advisors should be utilizing robos and AIs, and they should be using technology tools to automate their advice and solutions. And so I don't, to me, I think where I see the gap is how you would engage with a person if you have questions, and where humans can really add the edge is additional personalization factors, right? So like, as someone that develops these engines, and these are effectively more closed form solutions where like, if these criteria are met, you do this. Well, I can't develop a solution today that encompasses all of what is possible for someone's situations, right? I think when we overlay AI, it can help with that. But I think that that's where humans will have the edge, is that they can kind of, they can, one, be more empathetic than a robot can in theory, but two, like they're going to have the ability to kind of pull in different tools and know how to use different things that you just might not get through a pure digital solution. But the key is there's a cost for that. You're moving from a tool that might cost 30 basis points to one that costs 100 basis points. And I think what's good there is that there's going to be lots of folks that say, I don't need to have that personal touch, that personalization. I'm going to pay less and still get the advice.
So you were touching on the notion of cost and affordability that could maybe be a tailwind for these robo-advisors. But there's another notion that is trust. So I think many investors are still hesitating when using these robo-advisor or AI-driven solutions. So in your view, what needs to happen for these robo-advisors and machines, I would say in general, to earn the same level of trust as human advisors? Could they ever get there, or is that something that will just never happen?
So, I just actually, was it this week or last week, had a piece released looking at how the different sources of advice have changed for Americans over the last 20 years, right? And now the internet is the primary source of, or a primary source of investment and savings advice for many Americans, especially younger Americans. Okay, it did not exist as a source 20 years ago, right? No one was using the interwebs to like figure out investment stuff, and so I think what we've seen is a massive increase in the interest of people utilizing digital tools. Now, there is an important fall off at older ages. You'd think as people who were younger become older, but there is this kind of, you see this drop off. So there are still issues out there, right? I do think that some people will always want to work with people first. But what I do think is there's so much room for these tools to expand in the future. So what I want is just an increasing diversity of solutions. Historically, there's been human advice. Like that's been kind of the only game in town. What I like the idea of is a much wider spectrum of, there's still human advice, but there's also pure robo solutions. There's like hybrid digital solutions. There's just different ways, all these different ways that individuals can engage with getting financial advice in the future that covers a range of different topics. I mean, when I first was in this industry 20 years ago, I worked for a company where stockbroker was synonymous with financial advisor. You would use the terms interchangeably, right? We've evolved, I think, as an industry where, financial advisors are providing more holistic services, but I know lots of advisors that only do investment management. They don't do it, do planning at all. So maybe those investment-focused advisors can embed robo tools to help them do things they wouldn't do otherwise. And so what I just see robo doing in theory is kind of creating this much wider range of possibilities of services versus what existed traditionally.
And how much of the whole financial planning process do you think that can actually be automated? Do you think all of it can be automated, or like, let's say 80% and the last 20%, which is, the actual client meeting where you present the solutions, that will always be more efficient when done by humans?
So here's the problem, if I can use the word problem loosely. What's 4 plus 4? 8, right? Like that's unambiguous. Like that's math. Okay, you go to 10 financial planners, you'll get 18 different financial plans. And so there's this massive range of subjective outcomes that exist in planning today, right? And so I'm not suggesting that there can or should be a single set of standards, but I have a hard time thinking you can't, I'm sure that people have developed, you can't develop tools that can consume all the information, provide guidance on what to do, and then monitor it on an ongoing basis. And so, like there's a lot of subjectivity that exists in financial planning. So I do believe it's going to be possible to train models that can do almost all of it, right, at some point in time in the future. Now, how you communicate that to a client, how you get them to stay invested, like that still requires a lot of behavioral, emotional connections. But I do believe that most of what needs to get done can be done in an automated fashion. Now, at the super high end, for folks that have $5 or $10 million, and I think that will be difficult. But when I was an advisor, a lot of people's situations are pretty standard. They have a 401k, they might have a taxable account, and maybe they need life insurance. And so, I think there are going to be, kind of relatively similar households, are most households that could have an entire plan done effectively via a robo.
Yeah, I loved how you said that there's an element of subjectivity, and at the end of the day, retirement planning, as investing in general, is almost as much as art as science, right? Like there's a bit of both, and I think that's a very powerful, interesting idea. So maybe to wrap up the conversation, final thought here about the future of retirement. As an expert, if you had to summarize in one sentence, what will retirement look like in 2050, for example? What is your boldest prediction?
It's just going to continue to evolve. I think that again, maybe we'll stop calling it that. Like there'll be a new term we use to describe this period of older age, but it's going to be vastly different for so many people. It's really exciting. I think that I embrace the robos. I embrace the challenge. I think it's a really interesting, fun time to be helping people figure this out.
Well, thank you for that, David. For those of you that are not following David on socials, please do. But most importantly, just Google his name and read some of his research, because it's absolutely top-notch, very, very interesting and insightful. David, once again, thank you for coming to the show. I'm super excited to meet you in person in Chicago. For those of you that are still hesitating, please don't hesitate anymore. Buy your tickets, come to the CFA conference, and come say hi, because we're going to have an absolute blast. And David, thank you so much for your time. And I hope this year you keep doing some amazing models when it comes to financial model, and that you get published quite a lot.
Sure, thank you.
The Blunt Dollar is written, produced, hosted, and edited by me, Ignacio Ramirez. Everything you hear, concept, script, sound design, and production comes straight from my desk, and occasionally my kitchen table. Thank you so much for listening, and join me in the next episode of The Blunt Dollar for more raw, honest finance conversations.